from St. Francis Retreat Center here at Mepkin Abbey to extend a really warm welcome to all of you tonight. We're really edified, and as we go into another episode of the Mepkin Abbey Forum for Contemplative Ecology, of how many people are really interested in developing a more integrated experience of nature with their spirituality. And Victoria, having just finished reading your book, I can't think of a better guide to help us do that. So I'm going to turn things over to our able facilitator, Sam Keene, and let him begin the forum.
Thank you, Father Garrick, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this third gathering of the Mepkin Abbey Forum for Contemplative Ecology. We are really blessed to have with us Victoria Loorz this evening. And before I read her bio, I thought I would begin with the reading from her book, which just really resonated deeply to my core. And if you haven't had a chance already to read her book, Church of the Wild, How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred, I would highly recommend that you read the book and follow Victoria's incredible, luminous writing. So this is an excerpt from the preface to that book. This is a story about a land where the trees talk and the waters croon and the people fall in love with birds who love them back. This is a story about an enchanted forest hiding in plain sight, invisible until, somehow, the veil drops and what was unseen can suddenly be seen. You may catch a glimpse when you cross the threshold on the far edge of the abandoned field, or when, just for a blinking instant, you notice how the brambles of the blackberry bush connect you to everything. The ancestors knew this and reminded one another around their fires that they belonged to a great web of life. They were called into wilderness by a voice that spoke in words planted silently in their hearts, by the voices of the cedar trees, the lilies, the desert sands. Sacred voices tucked into pockets of the wind. Some of these ancestors were called out of Egypt, out of oppressive systems that didn't acknowledge their lives as valuable, called into the wilderness to listen, to prepare, to be tested and encouraged and strengthened. There, the wild creatures of the night, the fiery bushes and cool streams, and the manna that fell from the sky reminded the people of their true identity. Once upon a time, all humans knew their lives, their food, their survival, their sense of meaning and kinship with God or the gods was connected with all their relations, the hawks and soil and ferns and mosquitoes. Like all the other wild creatures, they belonged to the land, and they knew it. They were untamed and self-willed and listened to their own intrinsic authority. They were part of a grand conversation, a relationship of reciprocity and respect, connecting them with all the other beings and elements of life. But there came a time when some of the people could no longer hear the conversation. An elixir fell over the poppy fields, like Dorothy entering Oz, causing them to fall asleep. The wax in their ears became hardened, and their hearts pretended that they were happier controlling the world than loving it. They rushed right past the burning bushes on the way to importance, missing the message of the doe hiding in plain sight with her newborn fawn. They packed the bodies of sacred forest cathedrals onto trucks and shipped them to mills. They forgot that the thrush songs spelled out warnings and wisdom in octaves. Disconnected little by little, their voices went missing in the symphony of aliveness. The songs of the wild god cascading through the trees no longer guided their lives. And a deep loneliness sunk down upon the people, like a heavy fog nobody could see. The time has come to lift that veil of fog and return to intimate relationship with the living world. More and more of us are taking our place once again as full participants in the web of life, which we remember is held together by love. And with that, it is my honor to introduce Victoria Loorz, MDiv, who is a wild church pastor, an eco-spiritual director, and co-founder of several transformation-focused organizations focused on the integration of nature and spirituality. She feels most alive when collaborating with mystery and kindred spirits to create opportunities for people to remember themselves back into intimate, sacred relationship with the rest of the living world. And after 20 years as a pastor of indoor churches, she launched the first Church of the Wild in Ojai, California, and began to meet others with that same sense of call to leave building and expand the beloved community beyond our own species. She then co-founded the ecumenical Wild Church Network. Victoria is co-founder and director of Seminary of the Wild, which is focused on a deep dive year-long eco-ministry certificate program for all those who feel called by earth and spirit to, quote, restore the great conversation, in the words of Thomas Berry. She now calls Bellingham, Washington, her home, a beautiful land along the Salish Sea on territory tended and loved for generations by the Coast Salish peoples, in particular the Nooksack and Lumi nations. Victoria's young adult children, Alec and Olivia, are wise, creative, tender souls dedicated to creating a more inclusive, compassionate, and just world. Victoria, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Father Garrick. Thank you, Sam. Thank all of you. That was quite an experience to hear you read the opening preamble for the book. Yeah, it was one of those, I don't often get that, but where you just like wake up at 3 in the morning and write something down. That's what that was. Thank you so much. And I feel like you, this collection of people, this the vision for what this contemplative ecology, integral ecology, the work that all of you are doing or being awakened to. I see some familiar friends. Hi, Debbie. Hi, Maddie. Is part of a movement that's happening on the edges as we're experiencing a really dramatic unraveling ecologically and politically, civically, institutionally. On the edges, we are the ones, we are some of many, many, many who are sensing that a more compassionate and interconnected way of living is possible. And I think we're going to be the ones to midwife that into being. Maybe it won't be within our lifetimes, but the work that all of us are doing is towards a new way of being alive. That's actually a really ancient way, and a way that is deeply entrenched and deeply rooted in the Christ tradition and many of the other religious traditions that draw us deeper into love. I wanted to begin by just a simple practice, spiritual practice to help us be a little bit more in our bodies, a little bit more present, perhaps a little more grounded. So sit, like as you're sitting in your chair, shift so that you can feel your body is relaxed and open. Become aware of the way that you feel sitting in your chair. And this is a breath exercise. We'll be taking some deep breaths. So settle into the quiet for just a minute. If you take a deep breath in, allow your imagination to open up your awareness to how you are connected to the chair that's connected to the ground, it's connected to this earth. We're connected by gravity, by relationship. We're connected by the air that we breathe. We're connected by a really complex conversation that happens between the sun and the trees, the fire at the center of the earth and the moon, the waters, our personal nerve endings at the end of our fingers. We're connected to a giant web of life that includes the birds and the airplanes and the dogs and all the people. Taking another breath in, imagine your roots extending into the earth and intertwining with the roots of all the trees and the planted beings. You breathe in, take a big breath out. And imagine that all that distracts you and keeps you from being present in this moment, that all of those are being released. Your judgments, your to-do lists, the aches and pains in your body, the distractions, your whirling thoughts. Allow them to be settled and released. And take another deep breath in. And feel that invigoration of your breath, the air moving through your lungs. Maybe put your hand on your pulse by your neck. And feel that life-giving rhythm and flow of blood that's in your body and it's made up of water. And how that air and that water and this raw physical materiality of your body really is deeply interconnected with all that is. And all that is, as Meister Eckhart says, all that is holy. Another breath in, and then breathe out. And allow that visceral awareness of the earthiness of your body, that your flesh will one day return to the earth. Feel into that for a moment. And then allow yourself to breathe in with gratitude, maybe stretching out with a gratitude that you belong here, right now, at this moment in history, that your ancestors are with you, that future generations are counting on you. And breathe out with concession that your perspective about life and purpose and God is limited, is dependent, is often wrong. But also breathe in with a humor and a humility and a humus, a reminder that in the end, our thoughts about things don't really matter, that our place in the earth is secure, and that you do actually have access to the core of you that is holy. You know what is true and real, and that deep down, beneath the words, beneath any dogma, there is a pattern in all things recognizable in love. And so a final breathing out of surrender and a full yes to participation, full participation in this holy interconnected aliveness. Selah and amen. You might want to I would just want to read one little, this little book. I don't know if you all have access to it, or have read it. It's Thomas Merton's A Book of Hours. I've read it probably 3,000 times. There was about 7 years that I left being a pastor of indoor churches before I didn't really leave. I didn't leave the saddle of my faith and my relationship with Christ and with God, but I did leave the church. And then I came back after 7 years, which was an important journey of exile for me. But in the last 3 years of those 7 years, I read this little book every day. And I know that it was part of my awakening to the disconnection between my spirituality and the rest of the living world. And so I just want to read this one psalm that's on, which day is this? This is a little book of Merton's, just like sayings that have been brought together. This is the Psalm for Monday, which is Merton style. And in the middle of it, he's talking about the forms and individual characters of living and growing things, of inanimate beings, of animals and flowers and all of nature, and how they constitute their holiness in the sight of God. Their inscape, he says, is their sanctity. It is the imprint of God's wisdom and God's reality in them. I love this sentence. The special clumsy beauty of this particular colt on this day, in this field, under these clouds, is a holiness consecrated to God by God's own creative wisdom and declares the glory of God. There was something in that I kept going back to. There's something about the particularity of this holy earth that we fall in love not with. We can love the earth, we can love children, we can love dogs, but we fall in love with a particular colt on a particular day, a particular child, a particular other person, a particular other being, a particular tree, a particular place. And I just love how Merton talks about that particularity, and it was deeply woven in me. And so I started to explore, what does that mean? What does that look like? That every single, spiritual ancestor that's written about in the Old Testament and the New Testament, every single one of them were called into the wild at a particular important transitional time in their culture and a really important time within their own leadership journey, call into leadership. And so I'm finding people like you all over the place who are feeling that call into the wilderness, into the wild, into deeper relationship with this holy and alive and sacred place where we live. It's not just an environment, as if it's just there for us to be an environment around us to provide for us, but that it is a move from the old theology of dominance that's still very alive in our culture. And 30 years ago, I was really involved in bringing the awareness within the church from that dominance into stewardship, into caregiving, into taking care of the wild places, the natural world that we had access to. And that was our responsibility as Christians in particular. And in the last, really in the last 15 years, I've moved from stewardship into something that I think is emerging more and more, that Thomas Merton is talking about here, that Thomas Berry talked about all the time. It's a move from stewardship into relationship, that we're called into relationship with all others, that life is held together by relationship. And so it is moving from taking care of and pruning the tree and the garden, pruning the tree because it'll make it healthier and live longer and shade us more, into relationship with this tree and learning how to listen once again and understand and know that we have within ourselves the capacity to actually have a conversation with a tree, to actually have a conversation with the wind. And it's something that we all know, have experienced, but maybe we didn't know how to honor it. Maybe we didn't realize that invitation for that kind of relationality is actually built into our own religious tradition. And it's definitely built into our body, into our DNA, into who we are as an earth being. And so that's a lot of the work that I've committed myself to particularly over the last 30 years, but particularly in that relationality over the last really the last 10 years. So I'm really grateful to meet people like you and to see how there is a holy movement happening on the edges, perhaps still, but it's becoming more and more integrated into what it means to be spiritually alive as well as physically alive. So I don't know, Sam, or we, I could sit here and talk the whole time. I don't want to do that.
Absolutely. Well, so much wisdom that you've shared with us. Thank you for that incredibly rich introduction. I'm here to just be a mirror for you, Victoria, and to help draw out the well springs of eco-spirituality that you have been plumbing for all these decades. And so I'd love for you to tell a little bit more, perhaps, about your own story for those of you, those of us who might not be as familiar, particularly about like how you shifted from indoor pastoral ministry to the Seminary of the Wild. And, if there's any stories or any anecdotes that really sparked that transformation in your life that might be of interest to us all.
Sure, yeah. Let's see. Wow, and of course it's never one or two things, right? It's a series of awakenings, really, a series of recognizing that God speaks to us in a lot of ways. And gosh, let me think. Not that I've done this like 50,000 times. Every time I feel like, what do I need to say this time? So I think when I wrote the book, Church of the Wild, I started remembering these patterns, practices that I actually had throughout my whole life. And I started realizing that that was actually part of my story too. That when I was young, I always found a little place that was my own, whether it was just in the yard or some little edge zone that was near our house. We moved a lot. I actually don't live in Bellingham anymore. When I saw the bio, I was like, oh wow, I guess I should update my website. I moved to Virginia almost a year ago to help take care of my mom, who's in that phase of life, who needs more support. So that's where I am now. And wow, see, I just forgot where I was going. I interrupted myself to fix that. So yeah, so I started to see that there were these moments within my life where I would find these little places, no matter where I was. And in those places, in fact, I start the book with one of those places where I was a teenager. And it was a little place that it would take me about 20 minutes to walk to. I knew exactly how to get there. And it was just this little sacred place. And I would sit there silently and kind of look over it was on a little edge looking down into a canyon. And there was something really sacred about that, but I didn't have that word. There's a question that I ask. There's a couple people here who have gone through our Seminary of the Wild or are going through it program. And one of the first questions that I like to ask is, tell me, let's share with one another about the land who raised you. The land who raised you, We're raised by our parents, our relatives. We're raised by our school, different mentors, but we're also raised by our place. And so, just thinking about the places that I've lived, that's what it was. I've moved 47 times. That's what I was getting at. So I didn't grow up on a farm. I didn't grow up in a particularly wild place at all. We always lived in suburbs. but I always found a little place. And so I know that that's a big part of my sort of awareness leading me into this transition. I didn't go to church actually regularly and seriously until I was in my 20s. We grew up going what I used to call an American Christian. I'm not Jewish, so I must be American. So I must be a Christian. So we went to church on Christmas Eve, and I called myself a Christian, but I didn't really get it or take it that seriously until my 20s, where I had a very intense experience that Jesus was real and not just a thing that we talk about. And then about 3 years later, I went into seminary and did the church pastor thing for on and off for about 20 years, including that 7 years that I left being a pastor. But it was when I came back, and in those 7 years, I worked with my son in a climate change organization that we started. He watched Al Gore's movie and was like blown away by the reality of the climate crisis. And eventually, a long story, very, very short, we started a nonprofit. He left school by 7th grade, the end of 7th grade, and he became Greta. You're all familiar with Greta Thunberg. He was Greta 15 years ago. So we were just on the road for about 7 years. And he gave speeches to schools and the UN and colleges and conferences all over the country and in Europe. And for those years, we sued the US government, we sued all the states for, not protecting our children's future through the climate crisis. We organized marches, those kinds of things. And something happened within both of those careers, really. As a pastor and as a sort of activist, I hit a pretty serious burnout. And there's something built in to the system, the system that we're all part of, the system to kind of have you work so hard to try to change something and then not feel like anything is really changing. And in the midst of that pretty serious burnout is when I started to retreat to this little oak tree that was up the street when I lived in Ojai, California. And it was this gorgeous oak tree that her branches went all the way to the ground. And it was literally felt like a cathedral when you walked into under the branches. And it was under that tree that I started to ask these questions of where I experienced the numinous, the presence of God the most is out here under these trees, not really in church, even when I'm the one leading the meditations and the Taizé prayers and all of the things that I did because I wanted to help people experience God, not just talk about God. And yet where I experienced it most was on my own out in nature. And so this disconnect started to become clear to me, that I left a lot of my time in the church. I was focused on that sustainability and, getting us to not use, styrofoam cups and whatever, and to pay attention to our land as part of our faith. And then as an activist, we were doing all these activist-y things, but these two parts of my life were always separated, even though they were sort of still there. And so that's when I started to consider. And so it was really a spiritual intentionality that reconnection began to happen. And I started to ask that question of, is my spiritual tradition, is my faith, my Christian faith, and this Bible so disconnected from my experience of God in nature? Because I'd been told by different pastors that, God isn't in a tree. that's not where you're going to find it. That's not where you're going to find your spiritual life. And I had to know for myself, like, do I need to leave this tradition in order to be faithful to what I have experienced internally? And it's that journey where I started to ask those questions, and I went back to scripture and I went back to the stories, that I started to see, wow, this actually isn't disconnected, that the spirituality, that the full spirituality that I was longing for was actually written about in there, but distorted. And like, I would distort it as a pastor. I would spiritualize these encounters with the wilderness, and I would call them things like dark night of the soul, which is actually not what it means to be called into the wilderness. But I didn't really see it for many years until I started. It's almost like once I had the intentionality and the question, then the answers started to be revealed, and then I could see it. It's like the veil dropped. And oh, I love that, Kathleen. Lectio natura, yes. And that's when I started to see, that even Jesus going into going to prayer, I looked up every single mention of Jesus praying, and every one of them used the word, when it says Jesus went to the lake to pray, Jesus went to the garden to pray, Jesus went to the wild to pray, Jesus went to the mountains to pray. And the preposition there is actually the preposition that isn't a locality. It's not a locational word of in. It is into. Jesus, the word actually means Jesus went into the mountains to pray. It's a relational word. He went into the garden to pray. That there's something about the relationship that was there even every time Jesus prayed. And I realized in the church, we talk a ton about prayer. Like, my whole thing was about different kinds of prayer, centering prayer, and like I said, Taizé prayer and walking prayer, and then we would do like retreats that we'd have, when we're not talking about the really religious things inside, we'd let people go outside and just kind of wander around. But I didn't connect those. How often do we actually realize that mountains and prayer, like the wilderness and prayer, go together? That we actually, maybe we can't even know what prayer is outside of our relationship with nature, and maybe we can't really experience nature outside of our experience of prayer. And so these are the kinds of questions that I was asking, and seeing that it's all sort of right there. Another one was after I had started Church of the Wild, so let's see, after I was asking all these questions, then it was like, I started preaching it. I went back to the church after that 7-year exile, self-exile. When I came back, was working as an associate pastor. And so I only preached, once every couple months. And every time I was kept exploring this more and more. And so when it was time for me to leave, my very last talk there sermon there was talking about this idea of conversation, that there's something about the relationality that seems to be at the core of who we are and what religion is. Religion actually means religios. Ligios is like a ligament. It means reconnection. And so there's something about religion that is always reconnecting us back into relationship. And when I left there, I talked about this idea of conversation, I researched that one of my favorite scriptures was always, in the beginning was the Word, the beginning of the Gospel of John. And I just thought it poetically, there's something about it, it's always resonated with me. There's something in this, that Christ is the Word. But I didn't really get it. It just felt right. And then I started researching about it, that word logos, up until the 4th century, was translated in a way that was really understood by the 1st century. It was understood to mean something more like conversation than a single solitary word. And that I found out that by the 4th century, when Constantine was starting to make Christianity the state church, and he had just killed the other 3 emperors, and he wanted to be the only emperor, and he gathered everybody, all the bishops of this new Christianity together. Not all of them, a few of them were gathered together, and they were tasked with, there can't be this conversation. They weren't talking about this specifically, but they were talking about there needs to be just one way of understanding and talking about this path, this Christian path. And so it was right about then that all of the church leaders started translating. In the beginning was the Logos as one word rather than a conversation, a relationship, an ongoing way of living in life together. And that's concerning. And I found that 1,000 years later, the first person to start to question that translation, Erasmus of Rotterdam, he was the first person in 1,000 years to really look at the original Greek, what do you call them? The Greek pieces, the Greek, my brain is blanking on that word, but the first person to look at the Greek and not the Latin, and to translate it directly from the Greek. And he found that word actually needed to be translated as the Latin word that means conversation. And nobody liked that because still, even 1,000 years later, this is 1,500 years later after Jesus, but they were able to, wow, I'm really sorry. My mind just blinked again. I feel like I'm trying to say too many things at once. But anyway, when I learned that word logos can be, and actually should be, grammatically and historically translated as conversation, it really changed everything for me. When you read it that way, in the beginning was the conversation, and the conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. And all things that come into being through conversation. And nothing comes into being without that conversation. It just shifted everything for me. And the quantum physicists understand that as well. The quantum physicists understand that at the center of all things, at the center of atoms, is not a bunch of nouns, but verbs, the verb of relationality. They even say at the center of atoms is a conversation. And it's the conversation that holds families together, that holds countries together, that holds trees together. That there's a lot of scientists now and biologists now that are recognizing that trees are in conversation, that the forest is in conversation with one another. And so that core relationality can be lived into within that conversation. So when I found that out, when I even realized after doing Church of the Wild for a while, that the word in the Old Testament, Ba Midbar, which is translated as wilderness, that word actually, if you look it up in the lexicon, that word means, the first translation means the organ which speaks. It is the organ which speaks. We're called into the wilderness to listen, to be in relationship, to enter into conversation. And so that was really so it was really kind of like this theological inquiry. And then starting to create practices to say, what if we created a church service that was listening to the holy wild directly, that we're not talking about God, we're going out there and experiencing God. And then we come, so I started a church service where I sort of had an orientation, we'd have some prayer, or talk about maybe a particular aspect of what of something, you know, like listening. And then within 15, 20 minutes, I would send everybody out of the circle and to go solo wandering and listen deeply to the water, to the shadows, to the wind, and then come back and share in a circle with one another what they heard, so that the blue jays and the dust were the preachers. And then we were the preachers and the Holy Communion together with one another, listening to one another, listening in on that conversation with one another and with the land. And so, so then that's what we started doing. And I thought I was making things up. I thought I was going to get in trouble. I thought I was going to be a heretic. And then I started meeting other pastors who were also doing the same thing. You know, the first person I met was in outside of Toronto, and then somebody else from Florida, and somebody else from New Hampshire. And these are pastors from different denominations. That were also feeling this and they were also feeling crazy. And they were also thinking, I'm not going to tell my church I'm doing this. I'm going to sneak on the side. And then we started to find each other, and we started meeting and sharing stories and recognizing, wow, I'm doing the same thing. And I didn't know it was a thing. And we recognized that there was something bigger going on. There was something else happening. And that's when we started the Wild Church Network. And now there's over 200 churches listed on our map, and hundreds of others of people who are thinking about, planning for, starting to pray about starting a wild church in their community. And then I started Seminary of the Wild because I wanted to go deeper with people. And so we now have a 2-year program that brings you deeper into your own relationship with your place, the Holy Wild, the different kinds of practices, and rewilding your spirituality, rewilding your own soul, deepening in relationship with your place. And then the second year of the program is how do I apply this to my vocation? How can I share this with others? So I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but I think all those things were interconnected there, Sam.
Absolutely. And, you know, in that spirit of wandering, I'm so grateful that you were able to connect together all these different strands of your life experience, and to reconnect that with scripture, with theology, with these patron saints like Meister Eckhart or Hildegard of Bingen, other ancestors who have been deeply attuned to ecological spirituality, and then to find a whole community of humans who are reawakening, as you're saying, to this larger conversation. And just so amazed by this network and this community you've continued to tend. And I'd like to think that this community at Mepkin Abbey is a mirror to that mycelial web that you are really helping to evoke, in the language of Thomas Berry.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I'd love for you to, maybe before we go into breakout rooms, to speak a little bit more about some of the practices that you find really helpful in helping to bring us into deeper conversation and deeper sense of relationship.
Yeah, the core practice really is what we might sometimes call a sacred saunter, you know, a wandering. It's going out and, you know, creating a bit of a, or even like Lectio Natura, I call it terra divina, listening to the land. And so there's little practices that you can do to make that something holy, to make it into a prayer. And so, you know, one of the things is your intention. And so finding a threshold to cross, whether it's your back door or, you know, sometimes there's a log in the path. Sometimes there's some trees that are just sort of beckoning, and to be aware of where that threshold is, and then stop before you cross the threshold. I'll just sort of stop and with intentionality, with prayer, cross the threshold, and with a prayer of like, I'm opening up my intuition, I'm opening up my imagination, I'm opening up my heart, I'm opening up my ears to be able to enter into sacred conversation with whoever is beckoning me. And then as you cross over that threshold, wander with that openness. It's almost like a playful, like I feel like a little kid when I do it sometimes, just this playfulness of like opening to who is going to call you into a conversation. And you can feel it. You can feel it. You can feel yourself. You can feel yourself when you're in control. It's like, oh, I want to go over there to that bridge. That's where I want to be. And so you sort of start over there, and then you realize that something is beckoning you over to the side. And so you realize, you know what, that was my idea. I'm going to follow this bird that just flew in front of me. And so I think there's just within that openness, then you come and you kind of feel like, okay, this place looks like where I'm going to settle down and have a conversation. And there's a friend of mine told me this story where this is where she was very familiar with a woods that was right near here outside of Seattle. And she knew this place very well, but she was wandering one day with a friend of hers who was indigenous, who was from an indigenous native culture right near there. And her friend stopped and said, "Oh my gosh," and went over to the tree and took a little bite of a like the moss that was in the tree. And then she shared something that she felt like the tree was saying to her. And my friend was like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know anything about this. I shouldn't even be over here." And she's starting to really discredit her capacity to even enter into that depth of conversation that this indigenous friend was. And she talked to Randy Woodley, a indigenous Christian elder, and he said, "Well, did you ask permission? Did you ask permission to be in relationship with these others? That's all you need to do." And she realized, and so like that practice of asking permission. So when you're called to a particular place, just in your own heart, I would like to, it's like if you're going to sit down next to somebody in a coffee shop, you don't just sit down and start talking to them. You ask permission, can I sit here? It's the same thing. And you can feel within yourself when it feels uncomfortable. It's like, okay, I won't sit here. You can feel it. And so you're trusting your inner authority. You're trusting that conversation, which is the presence of the holy. In the beginning was the conversation. The conversation was God. So that in-betweenness is the presence of the holy. And so asking permission is another practice. And then just settling in and deeply listening with curiosity, getting beyond what you think the other is thinking and feeling, and trusting what comes up for you. So it's a little different than a meditation where you're always letting go and releasing. It's more like, Lectio Divina, where that phase where you are, memories come up or thoughts, or, and you sort of go with that and you trust that. Often people will write poems or journal or have a dialogue back and forth with the tree where they write it. So it's a creative, imaginal, and imagination, by the way, is we tend to discount it like, oh, that's only in my imagination. But imagination is a magnificent human gift. And how can we really trust that the imagination, our dreams, our intuition is a way of communication. And it's a way of communication with those that don't have that 7% of, they say 7% of communication is words. So the rest of it, we have that capacity. Maybe we can't speak leaf, and the tree can't speak English, but we can communicate on those other levels. So it's a playful and yet deeply spiritual practice to enter into conversation with these more than human others, and then to leave with gratitude. Your tears, a gift of your tears, a gift of a song, a gift of just your full attention is another practice. That's a huge spiritual practice, just giving your full attention to some other. You know, you can see it, like if you have a cat or a dog or a 2-year-old, you know, a 2-year-old near you, if you get down on your knees, give them your full attention, they just come alive, you know. And if you've ever experienced that, it's not just our pets and our kids, it is all beings. When we are really paid attention to, we come alive. And when you're falling in love, that's a reciprocity, that's a relationship. And so as you are allowing your heart to open in love for this other, imagine that other is allowing their, you know, heartwood to open up to you. It's just this fascinating disconnect we have, that's such an odd idea. Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about it all the time in Braiding Sweetgrass. And to practice that, to just practice having a conversation with a little spider that's in your shower, versus immediately freaking out and needing to get it outside. Maybe they do need to eventually go outside, but entering into just a conversation with the other and see what happens. How's that?
Beautiful. And I wrote down this insight you shared, that you said that in betweenness is the presence of the holy.
Mm.
And I'm definitely going to be marinating in that as we move forward, Victoria. For the sake of time, I think we're going to pivot at this point in the program to our next exercise, which is going to be a time to gather in breakout rooms with 3 humans. And if you're unable to dialogue in a breakout room, we just ask you to maybe press leave breakout room. And hopefully you're gathered with folks who are able to engage. But if you're not, feel free to leave breakout room, and with the help of Joy, our wonderful administrative assistant, we can reassign you to a different breakout room. So why don't we really let Victoria's words and the other beings that she invoked in her message just really steep with us for a time, and then have a chance to dialogue in these triads for about 10 minutes, and then we'll regather at around 8:03 Eastern time. Great. Thanks so much, Joy.
Welcome.
Welcome back, everybody. Hope you enjoyed your small group conversations and had a chance to digest so much of what Victoria graciously shared with us. And we'd love to invite folks to offer any questions or insights that emerged from those small group dialogues. And we invite you to either put a question in the chat or to use the raise hand function through the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to raise hand. So you can either put a message in the chat or offer a raised hand. And with that, we'll open the floor to anyone who is compelled to share. Kathleen, I see your message. I'm sorry that you didn't have anybody join you. I know you wrote in the chat a little bit about your experience with Lectio Natura. Did you want to have a chance to share with the group just briefly, maybe a bit about that experience you mentioned?
Can you hear me? when I was working on my master's at Loyola University's Institute of Pastoral Studies in religious education, I took an assortment of classes, and one of them, as I said, was with this woman who was head of the entire education department of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago. Was huge. She had a PhD and was well educated. And so I trusted her word was gospel, and we hung on every word. But it really gave me pause when she said, oh, there is this thing called Lectio Natura, and that is co-equal to Lectio Divina. I'd never heard such a thing in any of my studies. And in any of the classes I had, taken at DePaul or at Loyola, and yet I intuited what she was trying to tell me and how powerful that is. And the botanists that I work with, I do restoration. I'm a steward at 2 different natural remnant natural areas. The botanist that I work with says that the church is really letting us all down in not recognizing that the call to stewardship is a biblical thing, and recognizing that that this is something that we need to do. The earth needs us as much as we need it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kathleen, for those powerful and really incisive words. I'd love to turn the floor over to Diana and Gerard Barry.
Hello, Sam. I'm Gerard. Now, I would just like to ask Victoria to speak a little bit about liturgical practices with the wild church, and how, maybe give a few examples and how they understand that.
Yeah, there's a wide range of expression within the church, of course, just like within the indoor churches. And some of the churches are liturgical communities. In fact, the next book that comes out, it's actually available for pre-order on Amazon and other places, but it's Field Guide to Church of the Wild. And it doesn't come out till next March, but it has stories, liturgies, songs, practices from a few dozen wild church leaders around different aspects of how you can run a wild church. So there's a really beautiful communion, Eucharist liturgy that you can find online. It's in our book, but yeah, if you want to write to me, my name at Gmail, or victoria@wildspirituality.earth. I'll send it to you. But in the book, there are a whole bunch of different liturgies, and there are some. The wild churches that I would lead are less liturgical, but some of them were much more liturgical. There was even a few Catholic communities, more along the lines of the Catholic worker, and so then they had developed some really beautiful liturgies as well. So, and I know, like, a lot of the mainstream Protestant denominations have some beautiful liturgies within their creation. There's like a season of creation that usually comes around like in the fall. But I don't know any off the top of my head to show off to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have alternatives to, such as breaking bread? Say, maybe break some plant material.
Yeah, okay, there's an example. So what I would do with the communion time is we would well, when I was living in Washington, we would have blackberries in the blackberry season. We would have cedar tea that we would make the cedar tea. The one big aha, and I actually talked about this in our breakout, for me was also just that what religion, even Christianity, is doing is finding meaning in what life is. You know, so like the Paschal mystery is the mystery of Jesus, life, death, and resurrection, but it's mirroring what all of life is. It's mirroring how life is, that every season replicates that, that every generation replicates that it replicates itself within our lifetime. And what we were talking about in the breakout group is, for me, when I really started to contemplate that reality, that death precedes new life. I mean, that concept is so central to me. I tell anybody who's friends who are pastors that, you know, when you're a preacher, you sort of like have one sermon that you redo over and over again. And for me, it was always that. It was always some version of new life comes out of the compost, the emptiness of death, of some version of. But then when you really realize it, like all of life is set up that way, that we are set up as an aliveness that needs every one being. Martha, I'm repeating what we just talked about. Every one being needs another being to die in order for me to stay alive. You know, it's like predation. It's the way it is. It's the way life is. And so, anyway, now that I got into that, I can't even remember the question. What was the question?
About liturgy.
Liturgy. Yeah.
Liturgy,
So the liturgy is about that. Like this is eating the bread, eating the flesh, drinking the water, drinking the wine, the blood. Like that is how life is. And so there's ways to like deepen into that as you're in the, you know, I think the Holy Wild will give you brilliant ideas as you open up to those questions.
I think most of us probably, although rarely, have experienced outside liturgy, outdoor liturgy. Catholic background for us, we don't get it enough, but when we get it, it's incomparable. It's wonderful.
Beautiful. Thank you. How about you, Father Garrick? Father Garrick. Oh, I think you're still muted.
I need to unmute, Father Garrick. Thanks.
I think I
think you went back on mute.
There you go.
call it a paraliturgy, but what you helped me understand, I was just having trouble the way you use the word conversation. Okay, so I experience, you know, a tree inviting me into conversation. Well, then I say, well, what happens next? And so I was kind of expecting that tree to literally talk to me, you know. But I think what I'm understanding you saying, it's kind of conversation without words. And I loved your idea of using imagination as part of it. So I'm coming away saying, when you talk about conversation, you're talking about just feeling the connection with, you know, and the energy more so than what words, you know, the tree spoke to me. Any further reflections on that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I sort of, you know, it's like when you hear from God. There's certain times in my life when I know God spoke to me, and it wasn't necessarily in words, but I put words to it. And so, you know, and so here's an example of a really intense experience that I had. I was, and I recount this in the last chapter of my book. But I was out wandering intentionally for a whole 5 days with a group of people, and we'd wander and come back and share, wander and come back and share kind of thing. And unexpectedly, I just kind of was walking quickly along this path. I was late to get back, and this raven that I kept seeing flew right in front of me, and I didn't even think about it. I just followed it, and it flew right above to a branch right above where a great horned owl was sitting at like 3 p.m. And this owl, and I was stunned to see this gorgeous giant owl, and just sat beneath this owl and just kind of watched her. And, you know, I didn't feel like anything, any words or anything. I could just feel connection with this owl. And she would look down at me, and it's just like seeing her eyes eye to eye, knowing that she's taking me in just as I'm taking her in. And after about, I don't know, 15 minutes, she flew away, and I was just kind of like stunned and excited that I had this experience. I'm walking back, and I hear in my heart, whatever, I hear, "You need to be ordained by the wild." I immediately fell to the ground sobbing. It was a voice that I knew was God, but it was also somehow related to this owl, you know? And it's like, so it's those kinds of experiences that's kind of how it feels. It feels like, did I make this up? Was this the owl? Was this God? Was this me? And that's the beauty of it. It's all of the above. It's all of it. It's all intertwined and interconnected.
Well, I was comforted by that chapter as well, because you actually did hear words. You
But there were
heard,
words from within me, you know?
right, so that's helpful, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So like, you know, the tree's not going to start talking my language, and I'm not going to start talking her language, but we do. It's like if you are communicating with somebody who doesn't speak English, and they're, you know, you're in another country, and you're able to, if you spend time with them, just spend time with them heart to heart, you're able to communicate, but it's not with words. It's not, you're trying to teach them what your words mean. And so it's that same thing. And it's applying that and understanding that this is our capacity to be in sacred conversation. And it's like that other piece of that aha of like, oh, that's what it could mean, that when Jesus said, when 2 or more gather in my name, I am there. Like, oh, that as I'm having a conversation with you right now, that connection between us is the presence of Christ. That's amazing to me, that's the presence of the holy.
Yeah, thank you, that's helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, gratitude for sharing such a transformative, you know, epiphany in your journey. I invite anybody else who hasn't had a chance to share to raise your hand, or at this point, feel free to just come off mute if you'd like to share anything or ask a question.
Well, my conversation, what I've been aware of is kind of the paucity of nature, and living in a very, a development, and then so it was a good conversation just around feeling that, but also realizing there's the sky. There's always the sky.
There's always crows.
The sky. And then even if you're in the city, you're not going to have a mighty oak, but you'll have a weed coming out of a crack in the sidewalk.
Oh.
And that weed is it's precious because it has a relationship to the sun. It's green. It has all that going.
And resiliency to survive through those cracks.
Yeah. So I wanted to share
Yes.
that because many of us don't have magnificent mountains and canyons and parks.
Yeah. And it's all like we are part of nature. Like you've probably read that or heard that and gone, yeah, okay.
Mhm.
But like if we are part of nature, then this pencil is part of nature, you know, this tin water bottle is part of nature. Like we are part of nature. All of this is, so it all belongs. And so what is that? So there's some places that have been you know, sort of desacralized, desecrated. And so witnessing the sacredness of all things is part of the gift that we can offer, you know, that we can be the agents of resacralizing simply by witnessing and seeing the sacred presence in all things, even those that have been desacralized.
You know, Victoria, I'm aware that in beginning you invited us to check our own pulse, and our own bodies, in a sense, are a way of returning to that natural world. And
Yes.
I'm hearing you really use more of our senses than our eyes. Our culture is so eye oriented,
So
and I
true.
hear you inviting us to listen with our senses, with our taste, with our smells. And I know in our small group, that's where we went.
Beautiful.
We talked about the land that raised us, and
Oh,
we
good.
immediately talked about sense and hearing and touching.
Mhm.
And so I really have appreciated that way that you've invited us to see our bodies as part of that natural world too.
That's how we connect, you know, we connect with our senses. And I like that we connect with our nonsense too, you know, our intuition, our play, our creative, you know, our art, colors. And so, but it is like it's any of those steps that we take are like acts of resistance against a culture that disconnects us, you know, just by saying, I'm gonna. And we do it all the time, but we're disconnected from our own bodies, you know. We don't remember how to trust them. Thanks, Marjorie. What are you thinking, Sarah?
So, Victoria, I really resonated with what you said about it is what it is in terms of predation, you know, and you know that's a form of that's like communion, right? And I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but it's like I've never heard anybody else say it the same way, like you just did. But I think about Jesus being so attuned to nature, and I just intuitively, I just wonder if what he said about this is my body and this is my blood may have to do with his awareness that yes, we're part of this, which is a mystery. It's an incredible mystery.
Isn't it?
But wouldn't he? I mean, surely he would have thought about that a lot, you know.
I think so.
Anyway, it's just, I thank you for articulating that because I never heard anybody else say it, and I felt sort of alone with that.
It was a big aha for me, you know, just to really think about it, stuff that you're like, oh wait, I already knew this. But what's
Oops, sorry. Had to plug in my computer. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else?
Maybe you have time for one more question or comment before we close. Anybody?
Well, I'll go. Victoria, thank you so much for your really deep and personal sharing, which has touched me very deeply and a great confirmation of where I am in my own personal journey. I'm a Catholic sister and come from a really traditional Catholic upbringing and background. And my own journey particularly from being at Springbank, has led me to really reconnect with who God is beyond structures, beyond institution, within it, but beyond, just not limiting.
Yes.
And when you talk with the Church of the Wild, I was saying, my goodness, that's where I found God so often, just being out in the natural world, reconnecting there. And in a way, trying hard to reconnect my own faith and the elements of that faith. And I know someone earlier talked about, different rituals and things, and connected with something that's evolving. And I think being here with you today and with the others in the group and our sharing here, I think has made me realize church is so much bigger, so much bigger, so much more loving when we take in more than the human into consideration as well. I thank you for taking that step in your own personal life, because when someone like you and all of us do that, I think we make this place, our earth, a better world. We don't need to wait for heaven. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's right here. And that
Absolutely.
the elements around us of earth, of the natural world, is the body of Christ, is the cosmic Christ. So deep, heartfelt gratitude to you, Victoria, for your sharing.
Thank
So
you,
glad
sister.
of this gathering. I'm so glad that Mepkin has organized this, the great friends of ours. Thank you, Father.
Yes, thank you, sister. And thank you, Mepkin. Thank you, Father Garrick. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, all of you. It's been a gift to be here.
Yes, thank you so much, Victoria, for gracing us with your presence, and to everybody who took time at the beginning of the week. Thank you to the prescient owl and the raven and all the other beings who have blessed us on our journey. I've put a link to Victoria's book in the chat, which I highly encourage you all to explore and to sit with as you wander in your own spiritual journeys. And I'll turn it back over to Father Garrick. And before I do that, I might mention our next session will be on Monday, August 5th, where we'll have a pre-recorded interview with Father Diarmid O'Murchu from Ireland. We will play. But Father Garrick, any parting words from you?
It's pre-recorded.
And I'll invite you to unmute yourself, Father Garrick.
I would just say, let us go and commune more with nature and find God in new ways.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Go in peace.
Amen.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everybody. Have a
Thank
great
Bye.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.